So this morning I woke up and saw this great response from Tim underscore X94, who you should all follow. It's a very good place for insights on the business aspects of spaceflight, commercial spaceflight. And this was in response to a debate I was having with someone about Stoke Space's Nova rocket and how to compete with Neutron in the future, and how I think it'll really fit in well to both like the current paradigm of commercial spaceflight and how it'll have a very strong niche in the future, the same way that Electron fills a niche right now. So this very long response. First, this is why the internet's great, because I can post someone and a guy on the other side of the world, I think he's in the Netherlands, will respond with like 1,000 words, like detailing like all those points. This is why the internet's great, because we can have discussions like this. This is why you should stop using TikTok and start talking to people here. Right. So this was in response to Tim's post saying he focusing on buzzwords or whatever. Right. I'll make the case for Nova in a way that I'll try not to use buzzwords. You might not like that. So I'll make the case for Nova and why it will be successful in the future. I wrote this blog post a few months ago, why Stoke's Nova is a perfectly sized rocket and how it'll really, like I said, it'll really fit. It can really compete in the current market against partially reusable medium launch vehicles, and it will have a very strong position in the future. So first, why it will be able to compete for about the next 10 years while we're still using partially reusable or expendable launch vehicles is because the primary point behind why I think it'll be a commercial success. First, I'd like to say that this is more about a vehicle like Nova. This is a lot of Tim's points are about why it won't make business sense to make a vehicle like Nova, at least for the next like 5 to 10 years. I'll think more long term and show the long term strategy of why a vehicle like Nova, not Stoke Space's Nova, a vehicle like it, will win against a rocket like Neutron. And then we can start from this point in the future and extrapolate backwards. We can work backwards to see how it will work out today. So first, why a vehicle like Nova will win. It can address constellations because it's fully reusable. This is the biggest point. The constellations are obviously the biggest market. You can see this pie chart. And being able to address these is what will make your rocket a commercial success, right? So the reason it can address constellations is because even though it's at a much lower mass class, they're at around 5 tons, 3 to 7 tons, depending on if you're using the ship or the booster. But they're at around 5 tons, and this will, the full reusability will allow them to get to a low enough cost that even though they can launch, call it 4 times less satellites than a single Neutron flight, or 3 times less satellites than a single Neutron flight, whatever the number will be in the future, they will be able to get the cost per launch low enough and the cadence high enough through full reusability to effectively compete against Neutron. So we can see here the primary considerations behind launching constellations are responsiveness and cost per launch per satellite. This is just cost per kilogram, slightly more complicated. So responsiveness and cost per launch are both correlated with cadence. So if you have a smaller rocket, that means you have to launch more, which is actually a feature because you can more effectively utilize all your infrastructure and production lines, and you can drive the cost down even further. Right. Now, Nova can launch most payloads. It's not just about constellations, but the really important thing when you're building any kind of company, any kind of product, is to have intermediary steps that are profitable. This is how you know if a company is a scam or not. If they just have to sell you on the grand vision in 10 years and nothing before that will make money. This is how you know, like, why Virgin Galactic might not get... Virgin Galactic. They had a shippable intermediary. Hasn't seemed to work out too well. This is how you know which, like, self-driving car startups or companies that just try to sell you a grand vision of the future while burning $10 billion. This is how you can tell which ones won't succeed. Shippable intermediaries. Profitable shippable intermediaries. That's George Hott's term. So it can launch most payloads. This means they have an intermediary step before they reach full usability, even if they're completely expendable. They have the intermediary step of all the, if you can read this chart, all the LEO satellites between the 1 ton and the 5 ton mark. These are the satellites that they will be able to launch without full reusability. So they have a path to revenue maybe not profitability as a company, but they have a path to revenue just through this already. So they will have. It isn't completely a grand vision 20 years from now. That's a big part of it, but they do have intermediary steps that they can achieve, and possibly, if they like abandon all growth plans, they could become a profitable company if they just focus on these intermediary steps. Of course, they won't. They'll aim for the 2050 rocket that will have a cadence of one per day or whatever. But there are intermediary steps. This is the important point. So, zooming back out. This is focused more on the future with refueling. Nova could launch 28 of the last 32 Falcon 9 Leo missions, excluding Dragon. This is an important point. This is the shippable intermediaries. And because of full reusability, they could also, this again, long term, they can compete against Electron because they could possibly get lower prices than, I think electronics go for around 8 million. They could get lower than that if they're using the booster and ship 10 times or something like this. So if you're fully reusable, you can target small sat constellations, huge constellations, cadence high enough, Leo satellites, and they're planning to refuel, which means they can also go for geostationary satellites. And they've mentioned this before, but they could do a lunar landing as well, right? This is like 6 big markets, right? Maybe like 3 of them aren't too reasonable in the next 10 years, but you can see how in the future this will be very successful. This is a successful strategy. Now the rockets that won't see as much competition from Nova, because of its small size, it's really competing with medium launch vehicles like Neutron and Falcon 9. If you get to much higher scales like New Glenn or slightly Relativity's Terranar, there's less overlap because the cadence required to launch constellations on New Glenn, which has a Leo capacity of around 45 tons versus Nova at 5 tons, this is a 9x cadence increase. And if you have even lower mass to orbit, if you're using the second stage, which there's been like rumors of that they're at 3 tons, then this is even higher. This is where competition makes slightly less sense between heavy lift rockets and a 5-ton class fully reusable rocket. So you see less competition with larger rockets, and they mainly focus on medium rockets. This is where the competition will be. And this is in the far future, once we're past this like only boosters landing, once we get to fully reusable launch vehicles. The niche that Stoke's Nova will fall into is similar to the niche of like Electron or Firefly's Alpha, where you're launching. We can take small satellites like NASA's recent Tropics or pre-fire missions, where you have satellites that require unique orbital planes, and this can only really be done on a small launch vehicle. So this is really completely well suited to a rocket like Electron. This Electron's core market, which they will pretty much always have. Other satellites might do rideshare, but the constellations that require unique orbital planes, will always be with small sat launchers. So this is the core of the business. And once Nova, like I said before, it can service a lot of other markets, so that it can be able to drive cadence up and drive costs down. This will allow them to compete on small sats as well, and take this market from Electron in about a decade. Long term, we're thinking long term here, right? It's the important part. So the primary core business, the core segment that a rocket like Nova will have in 20 years once everything's fully reusable, is constellations like here I mention Planet Labs or Iridium. Iridium was each SpaceX launch carried 10 satellites, which weighed 6.6 tons in total, and they were actually volume limited here with space in the fairing. So this is the size of constellation that requires unique orbital planes that will really always be with vehicles like Nova, these really like under 5-ton class rockets. Now that I've summarized this blog post, which you should still go and read, I think it's put a lot more eloquently in text rather than words. It's hard to you can't edit your words after the fact while I'm recording, but I can edit the text. So I think you'll learn by reading this. I'll get back to what Tim said and where I think the real disagreement is between our approaches to extrapolating the future of the launch market. First, I think there's a big difference in the timescale that Tim was talking about and then I was talking about in the replies in the debate, which is my points were all mainly focused in the 10 to 20 year time frame, very far in the future. And Tim, there's a lot of points he makes that are focused in the next about 5 years. First, I took some notes. First, let's see. First, there's regulatory aspects, which let's all hope they're alleviated, that regulations aren't a problem in the future. First, Stoke's Nova, their aspirational cost of $500,000 to orbit. The hard part of this is technical, not the administrative side of having a $1.5 million range fee at Cape Canaveral. This is a regulatory issue, which let's pray that this is sorted out so that China doesn't win. But this is far easier to solve than making a fully and rapidly reusable launch vehicle. Right? This is like a point that applies for the next 5 years, maybe 10 years if the government's really slow. But after that, there has to be a new regulatory framework for fully and rapidly reusable launch vehicles, and you should never want to be on the side of regulation. This is the part that just like eats at my soul reading this. You shouldn't be on the side of these people, right? We want spaceflight to be cheaper. That's how we make humanity better, right? So I'm being emotional, but don't be on the side of regulations, right? The next point, 28-year limit. In addition, at the Cape, Stoke will never be able to launch more than 20 times per year. This is again a regulatory issue. Let's hope within 5 years this is resolved. There has to be a new regulatory framework created for fully and rapidly usable launch vehicles, otherwise China will win, right? Maybe when China does a moon landing, this will get the government to go faster, right? Don't be on the side of regulations. I'm being emotional. I'm not making a logical point. I'll make a new blog post on this that's more eloquent. But don't be on the side of regulations. Come on. This is another reply that's pretty interesting that I like to cover. I'll try to be less emotional. Agreed, in 10 years, I expect the optimal design being a carbon fiber lower stage with stainless steel upper stage. Neutron is a segue into a much larger TAM. I would not be surprised to see a third-gen rocket from Rocket Lab, but Peter has to run a viable business first. This is the real difference between a company like Rocket Lab and Stoke. Stoke has obviously not yet proven themselves business-wise. Rocket Lab is focused on building a profitable business. The problem with this is that you have to think much more short-term into how you get profitability, and you can't go for big grand visions like SpaceX has. Rocket Lab will always be a second, third, or fourth place player, and will always be following where the market is going instead of building it themselves like SpaceX or a company like Stoke will. Right? This is I hope we do. First, I'd like to say I think Rocket Lab will be successful. If you invest in them, you'll probably will make a good return. But this is a more fundamental point about how a company like Stoke, building a rocket like Nova, will be more successful in the future, right? Your investment horizon should be 20 years from now to optimize for long-term returns. So this is all take into consideration the competition that Rocket Lab will face in 10 years. Not for the next 10 years, you'll probably do well, but after that, right? Long term, what I've repeated many times, because I think that was the main disagreement between people who invest in Rocket Lab and myself. Right? So soon to be an investor in Rocket Lab, hopefully. Right. So once we see a third generation rocket from Rocket Lab, hopefully a fully and rapidly reusable one, they will already be 10 years behind. Right. If you count from like Starship, maybe more than that. If you count from other competitors becoming fully reusable, like Blue Origin has their Jarvis concept of a Aerospike reusable second stage, kind of like Nova. The Rocket Lab will already be 10 years behind, right? So do you want to invest in the third player, or maybe you can invest in SpaceX? Obviously, that's the holy grail of space companies that you'd like to invest in. Maybe you can invest in a second place that will do better than Rocket Lab over the next 20 years. Right? The time horizon is the important thing. There's also the difference in that if you're investing in Stoke Space, this is like a VC project with much higher risk. Rocket Lab, there's a lot less risk. This is why there's a lot more people talking about Rocket Lab than Stoke's Nova. The main people talking about Stoke are technical people, right? Which is also what Tim criticizes. So this I'm many points deep. The stainless steel upper stage, right? If it was right, first thinking long term, maybe they're better design trade-offs that you can make if you're not making a minimum viable rocket like Rocket Lab is. But even if you make the argument that they can add a reusable second stage to Neutron in the future, still 5 to 10 years behind. Right? Still will probably be successful, a good second, third, or fourth player, but you're multiple years behind. Who would you rather invest in? Right? These are all investors. This is why I'm talking about investing. Slightly a sin to commit the sin of talking about finance instead of cooler technical stuff. But you got to make money somehow. Now, there's another point that I think Tim misses. First, I'd like to say I'm not trying to go after you, Tim. He is very finance and business focused, which has given me a lot of insights that I wouldn't have had otherwise. This is why I said you should follow him. Right? There's a lot of insights that you don't get from talking to or following technical people. Right? This is especially important short term when you're considering competition with Electron from Firefly Alphas of the world or other companies like that. So first, I'd like to say Tim is great. Now, Tim said kind of stupid shit, and I'd like to point this out. First, my 17th point in this video. All Neutron has to do is open the first stage and hang the second stage, which includes the payload inside the first stage. He's making the point that from a launch operations perspective, the process of getting another Neutron out to launch or getting another Nova or Starship out to launch is similar, right? You land back at the launch site, put in a new payload, in Neutron's case, put in a new second stage, and then you try and launch again as soon as possible, hopefully with under a 24-hour turnaround, which is the holy grail that everyone's been talking about, all the companies, right? The problem this misses is the cost advantage of a fully and rapidly reusable launch vehicle is not having a lower turnaround time. I also don't think Neutron will ever get to even 50 launches per year, where cadence will really start to really kick in, like we've seen with SpaceX, where economies of scale, like manufacturing your second stages, really get it to the fun part of the S curve. The cost savings from reusing your second stage is, of course, not having to build a new second stage. Right? If you can reuse them up to 20 times, there you reuse your bill of materials 20 times. You have some operations costs there, and hopefully, if you make your vehicle simple enough and you make your ground infrastructure simple enough, you can really drive costs down below that of something like Neutron. Right? We can take the example of SpaceX. The current marginal cost of a Falcon 9 mission is around $15 million. I think all the sources that I've heard for this number stem back to Elon's third conversation with Lex, where he mentions the marginal cost of $15 million. If SpaceX is at over 100 launches per year and they're at $15 million, I doubt Neutron will ever get to either of those numbers, 100 launches a year or $15 million. I'll put it on screen. There's this great post from Ozan Bellik, who you should also follow, about the long-term manufacturing cost you can get with Neutron's upper stage. This is why the other post I showed was talking about a stainless steel upper stage, why you could get cheaper. So Neutron is probably not going to get cheap enough that they will be able to compete with something like Nova or even SpaceX, right? So the cost of access to space will approach the median cost of a launch vehicle, right? This is why SpaceX has a marginal cost of $15 million, but they can still charge around $70 million. It approaches the median cost of a launch, right? So once the other competitors get around to a $30 million launch cost, it'll approach that cost just through free market competition. Maybe you'll have a price war situation, but let's hope that only spurs competition, doesn't have the negative effect. So through full reuse, that's the point I've been trying to get to. This is why I've written more blog posts than I've made videos. It's a lot easier to type out your thoughts instead of trying to say them like this. Through full reuse, you can get much cheaper than, I think $25 to $28 million. And here you can get much cheaper than this. And reusing the second stage, reusing the hardware is the important thing. And with high cadence, Stoke allows you to, in the short term, get high cadence by addressing all the markets, constellations, small sat constellations, small sats, LEO sats, geostationary if you're doing refueling, lunar if you really want to go out there crazy, So high cadence allows you to get lower costs. This is the point, right? High cadence allows you to reuse the second stage how many times? 50 times, maybe 10 to 50 times, right? Depending on how optimistic you want to be. And this is what will drive costs low enough to be able to compete with Neutron. I'd like to conclude this video by saying that this isn't at all to be negative on Rocket Lab in the short term. In the short term, by short term, I mean 5 years, right? This might be long term to you. Rocket Lab will obviously be very successful, and this has only been referring to the launch business of Rocket Lab, right? And Neutron, right? Not referring to Electron, but Stoke Nova will kill that too. So Rocket Lab will still be very successful in the future. They just won't be a market leader ever, right? I think Tim has posted about this in the past and understands this as well, right? This isn't to say that Rocket Lab won't be successful. This is to say that a better strategy would be to pursue something like Stoke's Nova. Ozan Bellik made a recent blog post that's great. Everyone should read this, about what he thinks Rocket Lab should have pursued, or what a better launch vehicle architecture would have been for Neutron. Everyone should read this. It's really fascinating from a technical perspective. And it shows that really thinking about like long-term trades and comparing this to what Rocket Lab is pursuing now shows that they're focused on building a profitable business, not being a market leader. Right? These aren't completely separate things, but Rocket Lab is much more focused on being a profitable business, not being the market leader. You can compare this to something like SpaceX, which will spend $5 billion, create a completely new satellite internet market, or create reusable launch vehicles before this is even like a completely obvious thing to do. You can see like the ULA paper or some other discussions that you can find from 10 years ago on like the NASA Spaceflight forums, where it isn't a completely economical thing to do. But now we see with Starlink, they have created their own massive market and have become the market leader, right? Rocket Lab isn't that company. Rocket Lab is more focused on where the market is going in the next 5 years and thinking about the risk associated with a fully and rapidly reusable launch vehicle. There's a section here. Not many organizations can pursue full reusability, full and rapid reusability even. This is Rocket Lab's primary weakness, not wanting to be a market leader. You'll still be very successful in your investment by investing in Rocket Lab. They still have a bunch of room to grow, especially in space systems, especially in launching their own constellations, which is really a great driving force for Neutron development, which is why rockets like Stoke Nova and Neutron will be able to exist. Because Rocket Lab's building their own constellation, they can have their own source of cadence growth, like SpaceX has seen. There is room for these rockets to coexist. It's just that if we were betting on just rocket development programs, I would bet on a vehicle like Nova. Maybe I'll write a separate blog post on if Stoke will be the company to do this. I think they will be. You can see them going hardware rich and iteratively developing, which is a good sign. There's a lot of progress. So if we're talking about only rocket development programs, I would argue that Stoke has much more potential than Rocket Lab. They do have higher risk. Hopefully this can be played down through developing lots of hardware early, but this does have much higher potential. And through this higher potential, if you could invest in Stoke, I'd say that you can make better returns than investing in Rocket Lab. Don't quote me on that. They might go bankrupt, but a vehicle like Stoke is where companies should be aiming, not from 5 years from now. If you want to get 1,000x return on like Amazon, Nvidia, whatever big companies, you should be aiming for 30 years out, not 5 years out, like Rocket Lab seems to be. Maybe Rocket Lab, you can say they're aiming 10 years out, not 30 years out. This will make you a more profitable business in the short term, 10 years, short term, right? But you won't be a market leader in 30 years, right? And finally, I'll make one last point. There is convergence here, right? As we've seen in automotive, aviation, consumer electronics, anything else, there is convergence between all the companies. You have a leader early on, and then all the other competitors converge to the same endpoint. This is why all phones, planes, cars mostly look the same, right? So if we look out from in 20 years, I think most rockets will be most rockets optimizing for LEO will be fairly similar in their not their capabilities, but will be fairly similar in how they complete their task of putting mass in LEO. We can argue about different architectures. The results will be fairly similar, right? In terms of cost per kilogram or things like this. Now, the important thing is not that a third generation Rocket Lab rocket will be fully and rapidly reusable like Starship. It's that how long will it take them to get there, and what place will they be in? What will their market share be? This is what thinking 20 years out will get you. It'll make you think about where you will be in 20 years, and that's the important, impressive thing. Not where you are today, where you will be in 5 years, where you will be in 20 years, hopefully a market leader. Last thing I'll say, read my blog posts, only the good ones, and criticize everything I say. The reason I made this video is because there was a lot of like really good discussion on the internet. On X. This is why the internet is an amazing thing, right? And I'd like to get even more criticism on this video so that I can make another one, more blog posts, and keep iterating on these thoughts and become more correct in the future. I'm not sure I'll enjoy watching this video when I look back on it. This is why I've written 7 blog posts in the time between my last video and this one. I sound a lot more eloquent in blog posts than I do in videos, in my opinion. Maybe someone will correct me. But read the blog posts, criticize everything I've said. Thank you for listening.